Hello everyone, welcome to Module 7 of Climate Change course. In this module, we will discuss about potential climate change impact on various aspects of human society and the concept of climate change vulnerability. So in general, in this module, you will learn about the potential impact of climate change that have been observed on various sectors, including water resource, economic, agriculture, and also other sectors. The importance of understanding climate change vulnerability and also the appropriate process and good practice of conducting climate change vulnerability assessment. So by the end of this module, you should be able to identify potential climate change impact on different sectors, explain the reason why climate change vulnerability assessment is important, and identify good practice and appropriate mechanism to pinpoint climate change vulnerable group and vulnerability hotspot. Basically, climate change impacts are the negative effect or consequence of climate change phenomenon on the Earth system, including the natural system and man-made system. So in general, climate change affects almost every aspect of our life and every component of the Earth system. For example, our ecosystem already suffer biodiversity degradation and habitat loss, while human systems such as health sector is being affected by the spread of disease vector due to persistent change of various climate variables. At the same time, our economic system, urban system, as well as social system are also being shaped by the influence of climate change. For instance, persistent change in climate variables such as increasing in the Earth's surface temperature and change in rainfall pattern make us to reconsider about the way we are living and the way we are operating our business. And in many cases, it causes disruption of economic activity that might induce other social concerns such as massive population migration and also social conflict. So in the next 10 minutes, we will discuss this impact in a more specific manner. In general, climate change and its impact affect our ecosystem in a variety of ways, either directly, indirectly, or in combination with other anthropogenic pressures. So far, known impacts include change in the timing of seasonal life cycle of some species, habitat range shift, food web disruption, change in the distribution of pathogen, parasite, and disease vector, and also increased risk of extinction. So basically, for many species, the climate of where they live or where they spend part of their life influence the key stage of their annual life cycle, such as migration pattern, blooming, and reproduction. For example, as the number of warm days increase, winter time becomes shorter and milder. Some migratory species might change their migratory pattern, which can result in mismatching of migration timing and affect their breeding and food availability. On the other hand, as the Earth temperature increases, many species will migrate to a cooler region in the higher latitude or in the mountainous area. This movement causes habitat range expansion for some species, while force other species to move into a less hospitable territory, which increase competition among species and lead to local extinction for both plant and animal in some part of the world. Then, the impact of climate change can also affect particular animal species through food web disruption. For example, the decline of sea ice due to global warming not only affects polar bear population by reducing the extent of their habitat, but also negatively influence them via their food web. In fact, the decline in the extent of Arctic sea ice leads to decrease in the abundance of ice algae, which is the primary producer in the Arctic food web. This in turn leads to a declining trend in the population of a range of species, from zooplankton to fish to marine mammal, and finally to the polar bear. So generally, species that are particularly climate sensitive, such as the animals that are adapted to mountain environment and animals that are dependent on sea ice habitat, could be at risk of significant loss and extinction due to multiple effects of climate change impact. Similarly, the impact of climate change include warming temperature, change in precipitation, increase in the frequency or intensity of extreme weather events, and rising sea level are threatening our health system by affecting our daily food, drinking water, and the quality of the air we are breathing in. So some of the known impacts include temperature-related stresses, such as exposure to extreme heat and cold that can be a life-threatening phenomenon, especially for elderly and small children. Air quality impact that happen due to warmer temperature that worsen our air quality by increasing the frequency of day with unhealthy ground level ozone. Additionally, the impact from extreme events, for example, severe flood event, can also affect our health sector by reducing the availability of safe food and drinking water, causing damage to roads and bridges, which in turn limit access to hospital and healthcare service. Another important effect of climate change on health sector is its potential to threaten food safety and causing malnutrition. So for example, extreme weather events lead to disrupt or slow down the distribution of food, which can result in shortage of food supply and bring up malnutrition in some regions. Furthermore, the increase in sea surface temperature will lead to higher concentration of poisonous mercury in seafood products, which is also negatively affect our health sector. Then, aside from the physical health impact, some people may also suffer severe mental health problems due to climate change. For example, experiencing an extreme weather event can cause stress and other mental health consequences to a person, especially in case that a person lost his or her loved one, or the main economic result due to certain extreme event. Cities play an important role in the economic development of the country, as many business centers are located in the city area. So in terms of climate change, people in the city are being affected as much as those who live in the rural region, especially the impact of rising sea level, increased precipitation, inland flood, air pollution, and land use change phenomena. So far, the most notable impact of climate change on the urban system are the disruption of economic activity and damage of infrastructure. For example, the impact of climate change, such as increase in magnitude and intensity of extreme events, cause damage to building, infrastructure for water and power supply, transportation network, and other assets of many business bodies, which can cause delay in increased cost of economic development. Globally, the anticipated climate change impact on economic activity include shift in cropping season, decline in crop productivity due to prolonged dry spell and variation in rainfall pattern, disruption of tourism and recreational activity due to the increase in number of bad weather days, and increase in the frequent extreme weather event. Furthermore, significant economic loss is also likely to occur due to health impact and economic disruption, which caused by the damage of infrastructure. Climate change is also impacting on our society in every way, with impact intensity vary from place to place and from community to community. So basically, the projected climate change will affect certain group of people more than others, depending on the type of climate hazard they face, to which level they are exposed to each hazard, and how much they can deal with those hazards. This variation leads to different levels of vulnerability and equity issues in different parts of the world. So generally, what type of climate hazard a society would face and to which level they are exposed to are solely depend on the geographical location where they reside. For example, the community that locate in the coastal area are very likely to be affected by coastal storm, drought, air pollution, and heat wave hazard. In contrast, People who live in the mountainous area are likely to experience problems with melting permafrost and reduced sea ice rather than the other climate hazards mentioned earlier. And additionally, even people who are exposed to the same hazard would not suffer the same amount of impact. This is because different groups of people have different ability to cope with climate change impact. For example, older adults are more easy to be impacted by temperature change such as heat and cold compared to the young adult. This is because their physical condition is not strong as young adult. And similarly, poor households would have harder time to cope with the impact of flooding and other climate hazards compared to the rich household. Because poor households have limited financial resources for rebuild their home or relocate it to a new place, where the rich household can do it easily. As we have discussed in previous section, climate change affects every component of the Earth system and every aspect of our life. The anticipated change such as increase in global surface temperature, change in precipitation pattern, sea level rise, change in the frequency and intensity of extreme weather, and so on, will impact nearly all the social and economic sector. Somehow, key sectors that will be significantly affected by climate change are water resource, energy, disaster management, natural resource conservation, infrastructure and transportation, agriculture and food production, fishery, forestry, and education sector. Furthermore, the impact magnitude on each sector could vary according to different types of hazard. For instance, increasing in surface air temperature will have negative effect on everything, but major consequence will be on the sectors such as water resource, agriculture and food production, health, and fishery. This table gives a summary of the impact of anticipated global temperature change on different sectors. So for instance, for water resource sector, it is estimated that there will be increase in water availability in most of the tropical and high latitude region. While in the mid-latitude and semi-arid low-latitude region, there will be experience more dry spell, which lead to increased water stresses for hundreds of millions of people. Then for ecosystem as well as resource conservation sector, increasing in global mean temperature will threaten some species, causing decline in biodiversity and increasing risk of extinction, with the impact magnitude goes up with the level of temperature rise. For example, if global temperature rises by about 2 degrees Celsius, only about 30% of the species will face risk of extinction. But in case that global temperature rises by about 40 degrees Celsius or above, almost every species will face risk of extinction. For food production and agriculture sector, increasing in global mean temperature will lead to increase in crop productivity, especially for cereal production in the low latitude region. And for disaster management, particularly in the coastal region, there will be increase in damage from flood and storm, which led to many socio-economic concerns. Then for other sectors such as health, there will be increase in mortality from heat wave and change in the distribution of disease vector, which can result in substantial social burden and significant economic loss. So according to the summary in the table, it is pretty obvious that the effect of climate change and its impact on different sectors vary according to the type of climate hazard and also change intensity. So now let's move to the vulnerability issue. So basically, the term vulnerability means the degree to which a system or a community is susceptible to adverse effects of any particular event. So vulnerability in terms of climate change refers to the level of adverse effect which a system or community could suffer due to climate variability and extreme conditions. In general, the level of vulnerability varies depending on the characteristic and magnitude of climate hazard to which a community is exposed, as well as the characteristic of the community itself, especially how sensitive is the community to that particular hazard and how much the community can deal with it. So this means that even for the same hazard, different communities could suffer differently, depending on how much they exposed to and how much capacity they have to adapt with that hazard. So this slide describes some important terms that are related to vulnerability, including adaptation, adaptive capacity, exposure, sensitivity, and resilience. So adaptation generally means that the adjustment in the natural system or human system to a new or changing environment that take advantage of beneficial opportunity to moderate or reduce negative effects. Adaptive capacity refers to the ability of a system to adjust to climate change to moderate potential damage or to deal with a climate change impact. Exposure is the nature and degree to which a system is exposed to climate change hazard that may lead to negative impact. It is defined by the amount of people, livelihood, environmental service and resource, infrastructure, economic or cultural asset in place that it is adversely affected. Sensitivity refers to the degree to which a system is affected, either adversely or beneficially, by climate change. The effect may be direct, for example, a change in crop yield in response to a change in the mean of temperature, or it can be indirect. For example, the damage that caused by an increase in the frequency of coastal flooding due to sea level rise. On the other hand, resilience is the capability of a system to respond to or to recover from a significant threat of climate hazard with minimum damage to social well-being, economy, and the environment. And normally, a resilient system or community would be able to recover and return to its normal business by itself after experiencing a hazardous event. So basically, a system or community could become resilient when it is capable to adapt with climate change hazard. As a principle, vulnerability to climate change depends on the balance between the level of potential impacts posed by climate hazard on the community and the capacity of that community to deal with those potential impacts. So basically, even potential impact is high, but if the community has a strong adaptive capacity, the impact level will be moderate, so that vulnerability level will also decrease. So for example, if climate change leads to heavy rainfall in certain regions, and the crop that is traditionally planted in the region are not resistant to high amount of rainfall, then it will lead to severe impact on that region by decrease the amount of crop productivity or completely destroy the crop field. So in this case, the region is highly vulnerable to heavy rainfall hazard. However, if the adaptive capacity of that region is very high, for example, if the farmer there are able to switch to a more resistant crop variety, then the impact of heavy rainfall on that particular region will be less significant, and the vulnerability is therefore reduced even in case that potential impact is still the same. So in summary, climate vulnerability is determined by the potential impact of climate change hazard and the capacity of the system to adapt thereto. For this reason, vulnerability to climate change can be identified according to specific hazard at different scale for different sector and also for different community. So here is the example case of climate change vulnerability in Kenya. Basically, in this example, the arid region of Kenya is exposed to unreliable and reducing rainfall, which led to prolonged dry spell and drought. Due to the fact that this arid region is currently lack of irrigation system and drought-resistant crop variety, this variation in rainfall pattern will negatively and significantly affect crop productivity, which result in economic loss and increased poverty in the region. This means that under present conditions, This arid region is very sensitive to rainfall variation, or it can be easily impacted by the change in rainfall pattern. So to moderate the impact, various adaptation options must be taken. But unfortunately, local community in that region are not capable to do any adaptation action yet. So this means that that particular part of Kenya is highly exposed to and very sensitive to changing rainfall, but its adaptive capacity is still very low. So in such a case, that particular region is highly vulnerable to changing rainfall and climate variability. Another example is the case of the coastal management in Netherlands. In this example, the low-lying coastal region of the Netherlands is highly exposed to the increasing sea level, which makes it prone to coastal flooding and erosion. Although there are some existing dikes that were constructed along the coastline to protect the coast, but under the anticipated sea level rise, those protected structure is no longer effective. So the Netherlands is still highly sensitive to sea level rise. Somehow, the Netherlands is well prepared for such a situation. They have enough fund and technical capacity to cope with such a new changing environment. So they can build a new protecting dike or make some adjustment to improve the capacity of the existing one. So it means that although the Netherlands is highly exposed to and sensitive to the anticipated sea level rise, still they are not highly vulnerable because they have high adaptive capacity to reduce the negative impact posed by that sea level rise phenomena. So in summary, how a region or a community is vulnerable to a particular climate change-related hazard depends on how much that region or community is exposed to and sensitive to that hazard, as well as how much they can do to reduce the negative impact of that particular event. From previous example, you can see that climate change vulnerability is not only depending on the type and level of exposure to climate-related hazard, but also the characteristic and adaptive capacity of the region or community themselves. Climate change vulnerability can vary from place to place, community to community, and also from one group of people to another. For this reason, to be able to appropriately deal with climate change impact, it is very important to conduct vulnerability assessment to understand the risk and vulnerability among different groups and locality. So in general, vulnerability assessment is one of the first steps and crucial part of climate change adaptation planning. It helps us to determine the magnitude of climate change impact and also provide a basis for identifying the most appropriate adaptation option. It might be conducted for various purposes, but it can be categorized into three main objectives, such as to identify the specific long-term target for mitigating global climate change, which is called the impact by assessment, to identify vulnerable region or group in a society for prioritizing resource allocation for research and for adaptation, which is referred as the vulnerability-based assessment, and to identify adaptation measures for a specific region and sector, which refer as adaptation-based assessment. Assessment of climate change vulnerability vary widely. Depending on the assessment purpose, there is the main factor determining the scope, time frame, and geographic coverage of the assessment action. But regardless what assessment purpose, to appropriately assess climate change vulnerability, the key factors showing in this table must be taken into account. For example, to determine the scope of the assessment, both natural and social context of the affected area must be fully analyzed, and the main focus and expected outcome of the assessment must be clearly determined in advance. Furthermore, it must be ensured that key stakeholders, including the affected community, are fully and effectively engaged in the assessment process, and that the assessment process is transparent, which means that any underlying assumption made during the assessment process as well as in the assessment result are clearly discussed. To sum up, From this module, you should have learned that the magnitude of climate change impact vary from sector to sector as well as from location to location. Vulnerability to climate change vary from community to community and from one group of people to another, depending on the characteristic of the hazard as well as the characteristic and adaptive capacity of the community themselves. Vulnerability to climate change can be and must be identified differently at different scale for different sector and for different group of people. Vulnerability assessment is an important part of adaptation planning. It can help policymakers to identify the vulnerable group, prioritize resource allocation for adaptation, and provide basis for future development and long-term climate change mitigation. So now we can call it a day, and I will see you again in the next module.